There's a version of war that never made it into any textbook. No famous generals, no dramatic charges across open fields, no monuments. Just men digging toward each other in complete darkness, hundreds of feet below the surface, waiting to see who would reach the other side first. And here's the thing nobody tells you. The ones who got there first didn't win. They just died slightly differently than the ones who didn't. This is the story of underground war. Before we talk about who fought it and where, I want to start with something more fundamental. I want to start with the physics. Because once you understand what the Earth itself does to a human body, everything else about this kind of warfare stops making sense. It stops being military strategy. It becomes something else entirely. Let's start with the most basic problem, air. Above ground, you don't think about air, it's just there. You breathe it, you move through it, it exists in unlimited quantity in every direction. Underground, none of that is true. A tunnel doesn't have air. It has a trapped pocket of gas that started as air and is slowly becoming something else. Every man who enters that tunnel breathes in oxygen and exhales carbon dioxide. Every candle or torch they light to see anything consumes oxygen faster than a human lung does. Every foot of tunnel they dig further from the entrance is another foot the fresh air has to travel to reach them. The men who built and fought in the tunnel networks beneath the Western Front during the First World War didn't have oxygen tanks. They didn't have ventilation systems beyond crude hand-pumped bellows pushed through canvas tubes. What they had was a canary, literally, a bird in a cage. A canary's respiratory system is so sensitive it would lose consciousness from carbon dioxide poisoning before a human would notice anything was wrong. When the bird stopped singing, you had maybe 2 minutes to get out. When the bird fell off its perch, you had less than one. Think about what that means in practice. You're in a tunnel 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. You're on your hands and knees or flat on your stomach. The man in front of you is digging with a short-handled pick. The man behind you is passing the dirt back through a human chain that stretches all the way to the surface. You're breathing the same recycled air that 12 men ahead of you have already breathed. And you're watching a bird. That's your entire early warning system, a bird. Men died in tunnels without a single enemy soldier anywhere near them, killed entirely by the chemistry of their own breath. British tunneling company commanders listed bad air casualties in the same administrative reports as combat casualties. No special category, no special language, just a number in a column. But carbon dioxide wasn't even the most dangerous gas down there. Carbon monoxide is worse in almost every measurable way. Carbon dioxide at least gives you symptoms. You feel dizzy, your head pounds, your vision narrows. Your body is desperately trying to tell you something is wrong. Carbon monoxide gives you almost nothing. It binds to your red blood cells more efficiently than oxygen does, quietly displacing it. The first serious symptom is often unconsciousness. You don't get a warning, you get a tunnel, and then you get nothing. The men who designed these tunnels knew this. They weren't ignorant of the chemistry. They built ventilation systems as best they could. They used canaries. They developed procedures. And men still died from bad air regularly enough that it was simply accepted as a cost of the operation. Not a tragedy, a cost. A line in the ledger of underground warfare that commanders factored into their planning the same way they factored in ammunition expenditure. If that doesn't sit right with you, good, it shouldn't. But stay with me, because the air is just the beginning. Sound does something underground that it doesn't do anywhere else. Above ground, sound travels through air. It spreads out in all directions, loses energy as it goes. Your brain has been processing airborne sound since before you were born. It's extremely good at it. You hear an explosion half a mile away and you know it's half a mile away. You know roughly which direction. Underground, sound travels through rock and soil. Rock and soil are dramatically better conductors of vibration than air is. Pick striking stone 50 feet away arrives at your body not just as a sound but as a physical sensation in your hands, your knees, your chest, your jaw. You don't just hear the enemy digging, you feel them. The vibration passes through the dirt you're lying on, through your bones, and registers in your inner ear as something between sound and touch. Rock and soil are good conductors, but terrible directional indicators. When vibration comes through the ground, your brain has almost no ability to tell you where it's coming from. It could be ahead of you, behind you, to the left, above you, below you, coming from 10 feet away or 100. You feel the enemy, and you cannot tell which direction they're coming from. The military solution to this problem was a specialist called a listener. His entire job was to press his ear against the tunnel wall or press a stethoscope against it and try to triangulate the direction and distance of enemy digging. These men could determine whether an enemy tunnel was getting closer or moving away, how many men were working it, sometimes even what tools they were using. The British Army's tunneling companies recruited heavily from civilian miners, men from the coal fields of Wales and Yorkshire and the tin mines of Cornwall. Men who already understood how Earth transmitted sound, who had spent years learning to read vibration the way a sailor reads water. They were not soldiers who learned to tunnel, they were tunnelers who were handed rifles. But here's what no amount of training could fix. The listener worked in silence, complete silence. Every man in the tunnel had to stop moving, stop breathing loudly, stop doing anything that created vibration. And during that silence, every man in the tunnel was simply waiting, in the dark, feeling the enemy somewhere in the earth around them, not knowing how close, not knowing which direction. Just feeling the vibration and waiting to be told what it meant. Your body knew something was coming. Your body had no information about what or where, and you had to hold still and be quiet and wait. Some men couldn't, the ones who broke the silence, who panicked in the dark. They created a problem far worse than the psychological one because the enemy had listeners too. Now let's talk about what happens when a tunnel explodes. The entire point of underground warfare was to pack tunnels with explosive and detonate them beneath enemy positions. The tunnel wasn't the weapon. The tunnel was the delivery system. The weapon was several tons of ammonal or gunpowder placed in a chamber dug to maximize the destructive radius, detonated at a tactically chosen moment. The most devastating single use of this tactic in history happened on the 7th of June, 1917, at Messines Ridge in Belgium. The British had spent almost 2 years digging 19 separate tunnel systems beneath the German lines. Nearly 1 million pounds of explosive in total. When they detonated simultaneously at 3:10 in the morning, the explosion was heard in London. Not felt, heard. The Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, reportedly heard the detonation from Downing Street. The German front line ceased to exist. Around 10,000 soldiers died in approximately 10 seconds. The physics of an underground explosion is completely different from a surface explosion. When a bomb goes off above ground, the energy expands in every direction through air. Most of it goes up and out and dissipates. Men can survive an artillery shell that lands 20 feet from them because the energy has somewhere to go. Underground, the energy has nowhere to go. Rock and soil don't compress the way air does. The pressure wave travels through the surrounding earth at speeds that dwarf what's possible in air. It doesn't dissipate, it transmits. It passes through the ground and into every tunnel, every cavity, every human body within its reach. The speed of transmission through rock can be 5 times faster than through air. By the time the sound reaches your ears, the pressure wave has already passed through your chest. Men were found dead in tunnels after underground explosions with no visible wounds, no burns, no crush injuries, no blood. They simply looked like men who had sat down to rest and not gotten back up. What happened to them is what we now call blast lung. The pressure wave passes through the body and the lungs, air-filled cavities inside a solid medium, behave differently from the surrounding tissue. The pressure differential ruptures alveoli throughout the lung tissue simultaneously. The lungs fill with blood from internal hemorrhage. The man suffocates quietly from the inside. There's nothing to see from the outside because nothing on the outside broke. The men who survived described the same sensation, a tremendous blow to the chest that came from everywhere at once, followed by an inability to breathe. Many of them had no memory of the explosion itself. They were simply somewhere, and then they were somewhere else. There was dirt in their mouths, and they didn't know how long they'd been unconscious or what direction they were facing. A large underground explosion doesn't just destroy the immediate chamber. It sends fractures through the surrounding rock and soil in unpredictable patterns. Tunnels that were structurally sound before the detonation might appear intact afterward, but have compromised support at points no one can see. The tunnel looked the same. The tunnel was not the same. Men had to go back into those tunnels, after the explosion, after the collapse, into spaces where the structural integrity was unknown and unknowable. The tunnel that might collapse at any moment had to be re-entered, because the alternative was conceding the underground space to the enemy. I want to tell you about one man, because this is where the physics stops being abstract and becomes a person. His name was William Hackett. He was 42 years old. He had spent most of his adult life working in the coal mines of Nottinghamshire before the war. In June 1916, Hackett was working in a tunnel near Givenchy in northern France when the German side detonated at Camouflet, a small underground charge designed specifically to collapse enemy tunnels and kill the men inside. The blast brought down a section of tunnel. Hackett and 4 other men were trapped. A rescue team broke through to them. There was a gap large enough for 1 man at a time to be pulled through. 3 men went through, then a 4th. Then it was Hackett's turn. But the 5th man, Thomas Collins, had been badly wounded and could not move himself. He could not fit through the gap without being physically carried. Hackett told the rescue team to go. He stayed with Collins. He sent the rescuers back to the surface with a message for his wife. He stayed underground with a man he barely knew in a collapsed tunnel in the dark while the remaining structure shifted around them. The tunnel came down completely before they could be reached again. Neither man was ever recovered. William Hackett was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously, the only tunneler of the First World War to receive it. What stays with me is something the citation doesn't say. Hackett knew exactly what was happening to that tunnel. He had spent 20 years underground. He understood better than almost anyone alive what a compromised tunnel does. He understood the physics of what was coming. He stayed anyway. Now I want to talk about what extended time underground does to the human body. Because the environment itself is hostile in ways that compound over weeks, in ways that are genuinely surprising. Underground environments are not simply dark, they are absolutely dark. Not dim, not shadowy, light-free. Above ground, even on a cloudy night with no moon, there is ambient light. Your eyes have enough to work with that they never fully switch off. Underground, they have nothing. Your pupils dilate to maximum aperture and receive 0 photons. You are not in low light, you are in the complete absence of light. The human visual system responds to this in stages. Initially, it tries to adapt, waiting for light that never comes. Then it starts generating its own, a phenomenon neuroscientists now call prisoner's cinema. The visual cortex, deprived of external input, begins producing its own signals. Men in complete darkness see things, colors, patterns, shapes, faces, sometimes. These are not hallucinations in the psychiatric sense. They are a documented neurological response to sensory deprivation. But they occur against a background of extreme stress and physical exhaustion, and that combination makes them very difficult to dismiss. There's also the cold, underground environments maintain a constant temperature regardless of the season above. Deep tunnels are cold year-round, not freezing, but persistent damp cold that soaks into muscle and bone and cannot be escaped. Men worked in that cold for shifts that lasted hours, returned to the surface, and then went back down week after week. And there was the noise. Not enemy noise, the noise of the earth itself. Rock under pressure makes sound. It creaks, it shifts, it produces low-frequency vibrations felt more than heard. Men in tunnels described the earth as alive in a way that surface soldiers never did. Underground, you feel the geological mass of the planet making small constant adjustments. Your nervous system has no framework for that input, so it files everything under threat, and it stays under threat constantly for every moment of every shift. The medical records from British tunneling companies document a cluster of physical symptoms with no obvious traumatic cause. Persistent headaches, disrupted heart rhythm in men with no prior history, vision disturbances that persisted after return to the surface, severe appetite suppression, profoundly disturbed sleep long after the men had been rotated away from tunnel duties. These were not the symptoms of men who had been wounded. They were the symptoms of men whose bodies had been running an emergency stress response continuously for weeks. And if any part of this video has stayed with you, the physics, the darkness, William Hackett, subscribe before we go further. What comes next is the part the army least wanted to look at. The psychological damage done by underground warfare was documented, studied, and then very efficiently set aside. Not denied, set aside. Filed under shell shock or neurasthenia or nervous exhaustion. Terms broad enough to contain it without requiring anyone to look too closely. Way R. Rivers, the Cambridge neurologist who treated shell shock cases at Craiglockhart War Hospital, noted in his case records that tunnel veterans presented differently from surface combat veterans, where surface soldiers were destabilized by specific triggering memories, a sound, an image, a smell. Tunnel veterans described a generalized and persistent state of threat with no specific trigger. It was not attached to a memory. It was attached to a condition. Surface combat trauma has a shape. It has identifiable causes that can, with time and the right help, be worked with. Underground warfare trauma was different because the threat was not episodic. It was continuous. The environment itself was the threat. The darkness was the threat, the cold was the threat, the air was the threat. The knowledge that the listener might at any moment signal that the enemy was 12 feet away and closing, that was the threat. Not a single event, not a moment of extreme danger that ended, a state, a permanent, unrelenting 360-degree state of threat that lasted for every shift, and followed some of them home. Rivers noted that tunnel veterans were quieter, more likely to startle at low-frequency sounds, a truck, distant thunder, a train felt through a floor. More likely to report difficulty sleeping indoors, a persistent sense that enclosed spaces were dangerous in a way they could not explain and could not reason themselves out of. The body had been removed from the tunnel, the nervous system had not. The nervous system was still down there, still listening, still feeling the vibration in the walls, still watching a small bird in a cage and waiting for it to stop singing. Acknowledging the specific nature of tunnel trauma would have required acknowledging what the tunnel was, not a military tactic, not a strategic tool. A machine for damaging human beings, methodically, continuously, using nothing but physics and darkness and time. The armies that used underground warfare at scale needed those men to go back down. They couldn't afford to examine too closely what going down was doing to them, so they didn't. When the war ended, the men came home, and the world above ground had no language for what had happened to them underground, and so it mostly didn't try. One of the most physically demanding, psychologically damaging, and physiologically destructive forms of combat ever practiced by human beings is essentially absent from the popular narrative of the wars in which it occurred. The surface war has its literature, its monuments, its films. The underground war has a few paragraphs in specialist military histories and the records of men whose injuries were filed under terms general enough to make them invisible. There were men who went underground and came back changed in ways that nobody above ground could see. The pressure wave that destroyed their lung tissue from the inside left no visible wound. The weeks of darkness that altered how their visual cortex processed input left no scar. The continuous state of threat that restructured their stress response left nothing to point to. They came home, they were alive, the war was over,